Good evening and welcome. I'm Steve Reifenberg, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here to welcome you to what is really a celebration of the launch of a remarkable book called In the Company of the Poor, Conversations with Dr. Paul Farmer and Father Gustavo Gutiérrez. There are many things that can be said about this inspiring book. I will quote just one. And this is from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who states with obvious warmth, "Rarely have two such distinctive and complementary voices been raised together with more heartwarming and instructive results than here in the company of the poor." This book is erudite, fresh, and even witty.
I thought he said even at turns witty.
Even at turns witty. Did you write this, Dr. Farmer?
No, but it bothered me that there were turns when it wasn't witty.
It draws in a lovely way on a deep friendship between a physician and a theologian. Their own friends will, and this I can attest to, will celebrate this book, which will introduce a broad audience to important notions from accompaniment to preferential option for the poor, which are transformed in this book into vivid examples, not just of what's wrong with the world, but what also can be done to repair it. Clearly, there is a hunger for these messages. Father Gustavo and Paul Farmer were on Friday in Chicago, and there were over 2,000 people that came out, standing room only, to hear them. Obviously, tonight we have not only a full audience, fully filled auditorium here, but this is being live streamed to dozens of campuses across the United States through the work of GlobeMed and through Partners in Health Engage. All right. And actually, I have to admit that the students in GlobeMed that made those connections are the GlobeMed Club right here at Notre Dame. So in our program tonight, the two authors will speak and then be followed by remarks from two close friends and collaborators. I'm going to introduce the friends and leave the introductions of our authors to the president of the university. Robert Ellsberg is a longtime editor of the Orbis Press that published In the Company of the Poor, and since the very beginning, the conception of this idea has been a really enthusiastic supporter of it. And I also want to simply add, he's also an author of a remarkable book himself, which is called All the Saints, Daily Reflections on Saints, Prophets, and Witnesses of Our Time. I would argue such as these gentlemen. The concluding set of comments will be made by Ophelia Dahl, a collaborator with Paul Farmer for more than 3 decades, a great friend, someone who has inspired many, and for many years has been the executive director of the remarkable organization Partners in Health. So you're in for a treat. So it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Father John Jenkins, the president of the University of Notre Dame, who will introduce our co-authors and their wonderful collaborative work. Thank you.
I'm doing what presidents do, introduce people who need no introduction. But let me have a shot at it anyway. Paul Farmer is a good friend of Notre Dame, good friend of mine. I head of the Global Health Department at Harvard and co-founder of Partners in Health. He has been to campus a number of times. He's inspired our faculty and students, continues to inspire them. We're always so happy to have him back to campus. Father Gustavo Gutiérrez is on our faculty and a member of our community. Since 2001, Father Gustavo has had an interesting split appointment. He's worked here at Notre Dame as the John Cardinal O'Hara Professor of Theology, and he has served as a pastor in the slums of Lima, Peru, keeping close to the poor about whom he writes. He not only asks us to be attentive to the poor, to serve their needs, but rather to learn from their experience and to find in it the deeper meaning of Christ's liberation. In his foundational book, A Theology of Liberation, History, Politics, and Salvation, he inspired us toward a preferential option for the poor. Our church is richer and truer Church of Christ for Father Gustavo's writings, and it's a privilege for me. He lives at Corby, and to pray and dine with Father Gustavo is a great blessing to me, and I know my Holy Cross brethren. You know, Paul Farmer first encountered Father Gustavo's ideas while reading A Theology of Liberation in the Haitian countryside. They helped him make sense of the poverty he encountered as a young doctor in Haiti and in the United States. They were much in his mind when, with Ophelia Dahl, he co-founded Partners in Health in 1987. And together, on behalf of Partners in Health, they received the Notre Dame Award for International Human Development and Solidarity. Their mission statement begins, "Our mission is to provide a preferential option for the poor in health care." They don't merely serve the poor, they accompany them. They learn from them. More recently, we all heard, particularly those of us who are Catholics, a challenge to us to accompany the poor. Pope Francis, when he talked to journalists recently in his first public interview, said, "We must always consider the person. Here we enter into the mystery of the human being." In life, God accompanies persons, and we must accompany them, starting from their situation. It is necessary to accompany them with mercy. Paul Farmer and Father Gustavo are men of rare hope and generosity, whose example has inspired the prayer and work of thousands of people worldwide. One is a physician animated by a powerful understanding of God's relationship to the most vulnerable among us. The other, a priest and scholar, whose intense spiritual journey and devotion to the poor began in childhood and originally took him to medical school. They're both healers, doctors of body and soul. And both are seminal figures in their respective fields, one in social medicine and global health, the other a theologian and father of liberation theology. And now, with a great deal of pride and affection and gratitude, I turn it over to our speakers. I think Paul Farmer is going to lead us off. Paul.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Father John. University presidents, is what they do is welcome people. Now I'm going to do something bad, which is to correct said university president. In fact, as he knows, because we've already talked about this, I'd like to share this with those present and those listening in other universities. I was not a physician when I read Gustavo Gutierrez, but a 23-year-old on my way between college and medical school, and found myself in Haiti. And in those years, during medical school, and then as a graduate student, later in anthropology, I found Father Gustavo's work, to say helpful is just completely inadequate. To say consoling is inadequate. Instructive, inspiring, complex, difficult, frustrating often, sorry, Padre. It was all those things. Or as we say in scholarly language, it was all that. That flopped a little bit. But I was a kid, a student. And when Ophelia and I met, which was also in that year, 1983, And we decided, along with some of our Haitian colleagues, with whom we still work to this day, by the way, those who are still alive. Obviously, some of our colleagues and friends have passed away in those decades. When we started thinking about creating an organization that would provide make a preferential option for healthcare, for the poor in healthcare, where do you think we got those ideas? I mean, we did not, none of you should have to be alone and without accompaniment on a journey, and we weren't either. Now, we didn't at that time know Father Gustavo or Father Virgil or other people I can see in this room today, but we could read them. That is, thanks to their publisher, who did also translate them, I might add, into English. Americans don't do so hot with more than one language. But we could all be inspired by them, and were. And so the very architecture and fiber of our earnest and ambitious efforts to think hard about what we were seeing. Again, Ophelia, having grown up in Britain, in the United Kingdom, and I, having grown up in Florida, we were overwhelmed by what we were seeing in rural Haiti. And we needed very desperately accompaniment, guidance, ideas. And of course we got those predominantly by sitting down and listening to the people we were trying to serve. And that bond with the Haitian, the term that was used locally was the poor. And that was what they called themselves. Sometimes they say pepla, the people, but very often, and I see my friend Karen Richmond, who's a professor here and an anthropologist. We know the terms that they would use to speak of themselves, and sometimes the terms were quite colorful: the oppressed, the poor, on and on it went. So sitting down and learning, listening to them about their problems was certainly the most instructive thing that we could do. And another was to read and to learn about, so of course, learn about Haiti's history, learn about Haiti's culture, learn about the roots of the poverty that we're seeing. There's a direct line from the colonial template and the slave colony that was the largest one in in this hemisphere. That is the plantation economy on this the western third of the island of Hispaniola. It's a direct line, and many Haitians see it that way too. Certainly the ones we live with. Now remember, this was all prior to the collapse of the dictatorship, which happened in 1986. And then came this very difficult but exciting period of possibility and hope. And again, we kept on listening to the people. By now, we've decided, the two of us and many others, some of our coworkers from Haiti are here, Lun Vio, for example, who we met in 1988. And again, this difficult period, this exciting period, was marked by a great deal of tumult and upheaval. And I've tried to write about this in this book. The fall of the dictatorship, aborted elections, first democratic elections in 1987, some spectacular crimes against the poor and the Catholic Church, such as the sack of Saint Jean Bosco during Mass, which to me reminded me of what had happened in El Salvador, and that's how we met Lun, who was inside that church when it was desecrated and burned. And so in the middle, if you can imagine, and these are not things that she or I or Ophelia willingly talk about very much publicly. Why would you? But all of this, in all this tumult, I would say that one of the guides for me and for us was Gustavo Gutierrez. And his ideas, which I'll just mention a couple, Just the idea of structural violence, which he doesn't claim to have as his own, but which he has explored in his writings, as have many others. The idea of what's it mean to make a preferential option for the poor? Is it really that straightforward? How does it work? Or as Ophelia and I asked many times along with our co-workers, how can we operationalize this? What an unattractive word, operationalize. How can we make real something that sounds cool to say, make a preferential option for the poor in healthcare? The idea of accompaniment, not only of the poor, but of each other, of institutions that need to be remade or made. Again, this, as I've said here at Notre Dame before, in 2011 when we committed to this project, you have been a wellspring of not only inspiration, but good ideas. Now, this all before I ever met Father Gustavo. And as I said the last time I was here, you don't have to be friends with Father Gustavo or Father Virgil or some of the other people around this room in order to read them. Now, if you can become friends with them, I recommend it strongly. First of all, good for your spiritual advancement later. And that was because we went to Peru. And again, I'm excited about this book because it was a chance to write with someone who, for me, is an intellectual hero, and later became a friend. And I continued learning a lot from him about structural violence and about Peru. And I'm not going to go on any further, but I just will say one experience from the first year in Peru, or maybe the second year. Ophelia was there, and we were with our colleague, Jaime Bayona, who was the head of Partners in Health Peru, which is Socios en Salud. And of course, we got there 1993, 94. Jim Kim went there first into a place called Caraballo in the northern reaches of Lima. And we said, we want to meet Gustavo Gutierrez. Can you help us meet Gustavo Gutierrez? That's what we said to Jaime, Dr. Jaime. And he said, sure. It's a very laconic guy, doesn't talk a lot. He said, sure, I can set that up for you. I can hook you up. That's what, by the way, we always worried how we're going to communicate with Jaime Bayona, and the answer was he'd memorized every Beatles song that was ever written, and so he would answer or make observations with lyrics from Beatles songs. His other favorites were Breakfast in America, or was that Supertramp?
Supertramp.
Anyway, so we had no trouble communicating. This, by the way, was never a trouble anywhere we went. And so we did get to meet Father Gustavo, and we were hosting a conference after a close friend of ours had died of drug-resistant tuberculosis acquired in Caraballo. And that's what we ended up fighting with groups of patients, listening to patients, people who have been cured of this disease. Anyway, that whole story is told in the book. By the way, Steve, notice I said, oh no, I couldn't possibly speak more than 5 minutes. And the story that I told in the book was how we asked Father Gustavo to help us understand neoliberalism. Well, what does that mean? How does it manifest itself? How do these economic ideologies manifest themselves, not just in policies, but also in people's lives? You know, as I mentioned, I studied anthropology and by then was an infectious disease doctor, so I was asking, how do these pathologies get in the body? And of course, what Partners in Health does is how to try and get them out. Certainly we want to prevent illness whenever we can, but what about for people who are already sick? In any case, we decided to hold this conference, and we asked Father Gutierrez to recommend an economist for us, and he did, a fellow named Iguiñez. And he was professor and very engaged in, of course, in teaching and in research. And I didn't really speak Spanish very well at the time, and I'll be very upset if anyone said right now, nor do you now. But of course, I had to show off by not having a translator. I was sitting there listening to every word. And this is in Northern. Of course, where do we have the conference? The Oscar Romero Center. So we're all at the Oscar Romero Center. A lot of patients, a lot of community activists from Northern Lima, also from Villa El Salvador, people who we've met through Father Gustavo. And the economist is talking, he's beautiful Spanish, and I'm trying to learn every word. But finally, I leaned over. He's talking about how economic logics get in the body. At least that's what I thought he was talking about. And I decided that that's what he was talking about. But then I leaned over to my friend Jaime Bayona and said, Jaime, did he just say, my mother is not a shirt? Now, it turns out that is exactly what he had said. My mother is not a shirt. And everyone around in the audience, mostly people living in poverty or are familiar with it, as Father Gustavo was as a child, but also as a parish priest, they were nodding. Obviously, your mother's not a shirt. And the visitors from North America were having a harder time understanding that this was a profound critique of the commodification of human life and human value. And so, as a segue into a discussion, which I'm glad to direct, I would just say to anyone here who is a student or is listening, when you have teachers or spiritual masters or guides around you who can take something as obvious as my mother is not a shirt. Again, this is referring to an economist referred to us by Father Gustavo. But when you have people like that around you, seize the opportunity to learn from them. Learn from them by talking to them, just as you can talk to people you're trying to serve, patients, the suffering sick, the poor. Learn from them by reading what they write. That's how I met them, met him and met many others. And I just want to say that this has been a profoundly positive experience writing, and I'll thank Robert and Ellsberg in a minute, but writing this book with Father Gustavo. Started right here at Notre Dame, in part because, again, whether in Haiti or Rwanda or Peru, I got to go back and revisit his writings, his books, and think carefully again. Now, in my 50s, and after 30 years, and 30 years since my first trip to Haiti and first reading your work. That's my most profound advice. That's the best advice I can give you. Anybody can do that. Friday night, and I'm going to ask Father if you wouldn't mind saying something. Friday night in Chicago, Jenny Block and Mike Griffin, the two editors and architects of the book, were with Gustavo, and a lot of people came. Many of them were young people interested in global health, and I learned, I just sitting there on the stage with him, I just learned, as I do every time I pay attention to this man. There was a question from the audience, which he'd heard before, and even I had heard, and I'd like to ask it again. And it was really a critique, and or a chance. I think of it as this person offered us a chance to talk about theology, but also preferential options of the poor in healthcare. And the question was really around this notion of the poor we will always have with us. Now, I, of course, not a theologian, am thinking, yeah, how is Father Gustavo going to answer this question? And he very mildly corrected or responded to the questioner by saying, well, that's actually not what the text means, and here are 3 ways to read the text and think about what it really means. And I wonder, Father Gustavo, without putting you on the spot, if you would share with this group as a way of opening up, again, this tie between physician, physician anthropologist and theologian, and this book, my co-worker, Ophelia Dahl, and publisher. Would you mind reflecting, again, as you did Friday night, which again, wholly new to me, and I've read lots of his work, about this common question about what that means, the poor we will always have among us. I'm trying to decide, is that his, I told you not to ask me that question. Look.
I can enter them after.
What's that?
I can
Yeah,
after-
I'm supposed to
after.
be looking out for his throat.
Well, it's not easy to say something after, for me especially, to say something after the presentation of Paul, but certainly Paul is a person knowing closely the situation of the poor in Peru, Haiti, and in Africa also. And I think this question is very important. The concrete experience is necessary, I think, to understand better this reflection, theological reflection, speaking about the poor. It's possible to understand the requirements of this if we have some contact with this so painful situation. And I like very much the name of this institution, the Partners in Health, because for even the words are speaking about equality, and it seems to me it is very, very important. Not only equality, but with the sense, the meaning of to walk in some way who is the poor. And you know, in the Gospel of Luke, don't be afraid, it's not a homily, but you know, I am convinced the gospel is not only a question in the temples, you know, but it is very important for the daily life of persons. We have in this, I was thinking to one comment, but joke also, of a person, you know very well the name, I suppose many of you, the Cardinal Carlo Maria Martini. And in Luke we have two presentations coming from Jesus of his message. In the chapter 4 is the beginning, the book, more or less the beginning. He was doing a commentary to the text of Isaiah, and after that affirming, well, I am here to announce the gospel to the poor and to the liberation to the oppressed people. Well, the result was not good. People were not so happy. And even in the same chapter, we learn the people was trying to kill Jesus. And Martini says it was the young Jesus, first step, and a little naive in the beginning. And we take the second one, is in the chapter 24, and 24 is after the crucifixion, death, and resurrection, certainly. And it is the episode of Emmaus to disciples are going to Emmaus from Jerusalem, and one person close there is Jesus. Jesus has tried to explain them during this presenting his message, walking with them. According to the Gospels, for 7 miles, normally some hours walking. And the text says it is really Jesus taking his time, very slowly, starting from the beginning, and to explain after for what reason the Messiah was crucified. And Martinez says, well, Jesus in that moment is more mature. He has learned, and he was suffering, crucified. And for this reason, he is doing this, trying to accompany, is another important word in the work of Paul in this book also, accompany these 2 persons. He says, well, for the reason I say it's a joke, because it's not true. Jesus was not so young in the chapter 4, it's so old in the chapter 24. This is not true. But the idea is this, we need to take time to communicate something and to walk with the people. I think when I am thinking to the word partners, in health partners, I know very well the doctors there are are helping the poor, but to present the question in this manner is to respect persons. And the commitment to the poor suppose certainly this respect to the dignity of the poor. They are persons in need, but they are persons with feelings, with joys, and we cannot forget this. Another consideration about this also, more or less, I have 2 more. I have always 3.
Or 5 or 7. I've read those books.
Is a little question, it seems to me important, is this. Spontaneously, many persons thinking the preferential option for the poor is the question of the non-poor persons. Well, it is not true. And the preferential option for the poor is for any person, any Christian, and even any person who is a sense of solidarity who is suffering. And even the poor themselves. Even the poor must do the option for the poor. It is not enough to be poor. And the preferential option for the poor is asking solidarity with other poor. I was in my life working in parishes, always in the very poor milieu, and it is easy to see this. We have poor without commitment to other poor. It is true. We must avoid to idealize this question and the requirement of the solidarity. And in this walking, my first point, in this walking, I think we need to communicate this also to persons. You must be persons, you must discussing with them, and so, but to recall this is universal and without exception requirement to be in solidarity with the suffering and needing persons. My third point is a little different, is shorter also. I am always very impressed when I am reading or listening Paul about the motivation of his work. And at the same time, I think it is one important aspect of our reflection in coming from a poor milieu. I think practice is a key question. It is not all, but it's a key question. These theological reflections come from experience, but going to experience also. And to change, experience of change, the situation of marginalization, of oppression of persons. But in this sense, if very often I am surprised by Paul when he speaks, affirming my work is the inspiration comes from this question. At the same time, I think it is one manner to express really this, the commitment, the solidarity with the poor, and the effort of Paul and his team is a beautiful manner to put one vision, one manner to understand our duties as Christians in practice. This is really very important because without this kind of cases and examples, it's not easy really to understand what we are looking when we speak about the preferential option for the poor. I have sometimes, I am afraid sometimes, thinking about the repetition of the expression because in one moment could be so formal. Only concrete witness doing this is really, really clear. It's a really witness. Finally, we know this very well in several cases in the contemporary church, certainly in the whole history of the church, but because Paul has mentioned in one moment, Romero is the case. Romero has a sentence affirming this. The way to be close to the God of Jesus Christ is to be close to the poor. Close is not only to affirm, we must do this, but in some way, finally, it's not the fourth point because it's against my custom, but the conclusion. And I can say, maybe you are thinking about the manners to do the option for the poor. Well, 1,000 manners to do that. 1,000 manners. Because it depends of our condition, our health, our age, our possibilities, but we cannot say no. I think finally to do the option for the poor is to put in practice the great Christian commandment to love the neighbor. You know, Paul, Saint Paul, in one, the other I don't know if he's so saint, but Paul has said in one letter the synthesis of the Christian message is to love the neighbor. It seems strange because Paul sometimes is so God and so, well, in one moment he says this. To be Christian is this. Preferential option for the poor is a way to do that. Thanks.
Thank you, Father. Going back to a point you've made many times, and to bring in our friends on the panel, and then all of those here. There are 1,000 ways, mil maneras, to make a preferential option for the poor, as you've said.
I think so.
And it's not okay to say no. Poor people living in poverty, also need to make a preferential option for the poor. Most of us here, I think we should be tough on ourselves about this. We're not poor people. We're not living in poverty. And so I'm going to ask Robert Ellsberg to say a couple things. Robert, you make your contribution to a preferential option for the poor by being, as Steve noted, a writer, but also as an editor, as a publisher. And I just would like to hear a little bit about, looking back on your experience, what Gustavo's work has meant for the press, for Orbis, and if you don't mind, for you personally, and just to tell us a little bit about your work.
Sure. I'm very proud to be here, both as the publisher of the book, in the Company of the Poor, but also as the publisher of all of Gustavo's works, beginning with his seminal work, A Theology of Liberation, which was published in English in 1973. Orbis began as the publishing arm of Maryknoll Fathers and Brothers in 1970. And Gustavo's book, I think it's fair to say, became really the cornerstone of a publishing program that I think was unique. I'm not boasting since I didn't start it, but for a publishing house that in effect made an option for the poor by standing in solidarity with those at the margins and trying to amplify voices that were marginalized. In the early years, particularly the work of the liberation theologians of Latin America, Gustavo and Leonard Oboff, John Sobrino, many others. I was late coming to this personally, but Gustavo played a very important role. I guess my own journey began in the late 70s working with Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker, where I was first exposed to the poor and to an understanding of the social implications of the gospel. Dorothy Day, even in her autobiography, writes about as a child when she first read about the lives of the saints, and they said there were so many saints who cared for the poor and the sick, the leper, but where were the saints to change the social order, she said? Where were the saints not just to bind up the wounds of the slaves, but to do away with slavery? So that was very much in my blood, those kind of questions that were answered in Dorothy Day's life by the Catholic Worker. But it was really the death of Oscar Romero in 1980 that turned my attention to Latin America and the fact that something extraordinary was happening down there and that had not been very much on my radar screen. And I decided to go to Latin America. And it was there that I first read A Theology of Liberation. And it absolutely blew my mind. I had no theological training, and I I practically had to have a dictionary, not to understand the Spanish, but to understand the English, going through this line by line. And it was really the first time that I perceived that theology was not just sort of an armchair discipline, but not just a way of reflecting on faith, but a way of inspiring and mobilizing people for action and engagement and to an effort to change the world. And it was that experience that made me decide to study theology myself. So I went to graduate school and studied theology. And after a few years, I realized I was not, cut out to be another Gustavo Gutiérrez, but I could be his publisher. And I was, I guess, through all my reading of this liberation theology and all the love that I felt for Gustavo and these other liberation theologians, there was also as Karl Rahner would say, a kind of co-knowing or co-love of the publishing house Orbis that was home for so many of these books. And I was delighted then when I had the opportunity to come and work at Orbis Books. That's 26 years ago now. And since then, a great honor, more than anything, to have played a small role in making Gustavo's books available in English. And living through a dramatic time. It's hard looking how unassuming and mild-mannered it is now. It's hard to recall that there was a time when Gustavo, many people in places of power regarded him as the most, public enemy number one, most dangerous man in the church or the world. And these were, I remember, 25 years ago next year when my author, Ignacio Ellacuría, and his Jesuit community were massacred. I remember when my author, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, was elected president of Haiti and then overthrown in a coup. Twice. I happened to meet Paul Farmer when he accompanied Aristide to Maryknoll when he was in exile with his Secret Service convoy that he was still the president of Haiti in exile. These were times when it really felt as if we were on the barricades. I'm glad, in some ways that we've moved beyond that to a time now when I think Gustavo's contributions are recognized, and the concept of the option for the poor has become so embraced by the church. But for many years, people have read the epitaph, for liberation theology, and Gustavo always said, what the important question is not the future of liberation theology. The important thing is the liberation of the oppressed. I just wanted to read this from the last. The conclusion in his book, he said, all the political theologies are not worth one act of genuine solidarity. They are not worth one act of faith, love, and hope committed in one way or another, in active participation to liberate humankind from everything that dehumanizes it and prevents it from living according to the will of God. And I want to just also thank Notre Dame for this conversation. I think it's an extremely important moment for liberation theology to move outside of the ecclesial and theological, conference room into engagement and dialogue with other disciplines, in this case, medicine, public health, but the implication is that there are so many other different disciplines that have their own contribution to make in the option for the poor. As Paul said, I like to think that publishing has been my path. But again, ultimately, the important thing is not the book here that we celebrate, but what action it motivates, what deeds it inspires, and the hope, that one other person will respond in some kind of active, effective friendship and solidarity with the poor.
Thank you, Robert. And that I'm going to bring Ophelia into the conversation because these corporal acts of mercy and solidarity to liberate people from oppressive conditions is what Ophelia and others working with Partners in Health have done with their time. And Ophelia comes from a very different background than Father Gustavo or probably any of you, unless your father was Roald Dahl, the writer. course, that could be said about every human being. Not that your father was Roald Dahl, the writer, but rather that you come from circumstances. And it was obvious when she first went to Haiti that this would be her choice in life. And having brought so many people along with you, I'd just like you to reflect a little on these notions in your life.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. I just want to start off by thanking Notre Dame, or Notre Dame, as they say here, sorry. Notre Dame, Notre Dame. I have to practice my American accent in that respect. But to thank Father John Jenkins, to thank the Kellogg Institute, to thank Steve Reifenberg, to thank so many people here, and to really say how lovely it is to be back in the embrace of this very welcoming community. It's both soothing and energizing. It's both a balm and a tonic, without question, and for many reasons, and I'll reflect on a couple of reasons why. But I also want to say, just because any opportunity I can to hold this book up, knowing that this is being projected through the intertubes is a good thing. But being part of this magnificent effort, and knowing that this effort is a team of people, a handful are on the stage, and Mike Griffin and Jenny Block, and also so many others involved in making sure that this actually came to pass. And it's one of the things that it's one of the ways through which this work can be communicated. Over the last couple of days, we have had a chance. A group of us have had a chance to gather here and to reflect a little bit on the mission of Partners in Health, and of the mission of the work that Notre Dame does, and to see how we can echo and amplify and leverage our work, and also to think about how we might connect the intimate side of accompaniment with the exponential side of accompaniment. And it's been tremendously energizing and refreshing to do that. As part of that, I was sitting on the plane with a colleague who we've already talked about, mentioned here, John Mirror, Dr. John Mirror. And as we were talking about where we were going, and John is an alum of this fine university, and he was singing its praises, of course. But as he was talking, he was the one who re-pointed out to me the mission of this university, which I think is an important thing to do, which is because it's enacted out by so many of you in many different ways. And before I move off the notion of partnership, I also want to say that the partnership that it took to create this book is echo and amplified by so many other partnerships that we have had the privilege to be part of, including GlobeMed and including the students here. But this mission of yours, of Notre Dame's, I just want to mention it. It says, as part of it, it's a disciplined sensibility to the poverty, injustice, and oppression that burdens the lives of so many. And its aim is to create a sense of human solidarity and concern for the common good that will bear fruit as learning becomes service to justice. Part of the mission of your university, which you're all familiar with, it's not only written as a mission, it is then, when you go to your home page, the very first thing that you see. The very first thing that you see is HIV awareness in South Africa. So finding ourselves lucky enough to be connected to a place that thinks about its mission and enacts it as not only a learning institute, an institute of reflection and research, but actually connects it to service, is a very heartening thing, as I said, for us in this. The connection to Partners in Health's mission as well, and part of our mission, which we thought very carefully about for a long time, and as Paul has pointed out many times, hasn't changed over the years. We feel very connected to it, states as part of it two overarching goals, which are to bring the benefits of modern medical science to those most in need of them, and to serve as an antidote for despair. And as we have reflected on some of this over the last 2 days, it has been a very powerful thing to think about this, because as with so many things that occur to you later on, after you've done them or as you're doing them, not immediately, to know that the antidote to despair, certainly for me, when we wrote this, was for the communities we served. And realizing later on that, of course, it's also served as an antidote to despair for all of us, which has become an important piece for us to examine and look at. And I'll give you a couple of examples. The antidote to despair for us, in part, is seeing the changes that have taken place in the last decade, thanks to a huge group of people engaged in this work. And to know about the efforts that we were involved in 10 or 20 years ago that have borne fruit. I'm thinking particularly of the ways that global health has changed over the years. The discipline itself, the collection of disciplines, the field has changed, and the results that have occurred over time has been nothing short of miraculous in many ways. To have seen minds changed and policy changed, to see $30 billion invested in global health, to know so many of you and others engaged in changing being part of insisting on changing the fates of so many that we can't see, which is part of what we all have to do through our own imaginations, if we're not in proximity. And I want to tell you one very quick story, because last week we reflected also on the mission at a trustees meeting at Partners in Health. And Steve was with us in Boston as we did this. And we were trying to connect the notion of leveraging service, what Partners in Health is pretty equipped to do, the service piece, with research and teaching, with data and training. And as we did so, we decided to ask a colleague of ours from Haiti, Pierre-Paul, a doctor, clinician, to talk to us a little bit about what it meant to have been educated as a doctor in Haiti, and to have seen that medical education change over time as we were able to bolster it with a more detailed training postgraduate medical school. Things that are second nature to all of us, that we are socialized to expect such things. And as he reflected on it, he really did talk about how it had been an antidote to despair for him as a young medical student who recently, after graduation, then used to have to spend time in the university hospital in Port-au-Prince ministering to patients without having the tools or the training to be able to do what he had so yearned to do, to take care of patients. And he talked about specifically, which was very poignant to hear, after you had diagnosed a patient and written down a prescription, giving it to the family or the patient themselves to go and find their own medicine. and then come back into the hospital, and often it didn't happen, or it was too late. And then as a clinician to be part of, after the patient died, often a young person, to be part of negotiating with, as a clinician, negotiating with another family who might make use of those medicines on behalf of the family of the patient who died. So imagine being a clinician. You have to watch someone die of a treatable illness, and then you have to negotiate the commerce of this commodity to another family who are put in this position. He said the single most heartening, buoying thing for him was seeing that change in a short number of years as a doctor, to be able to see what happens when you can be trained and connected to institutions and to medical schools and to large tertiary hospitals and to educational institutions like this one. Those are some of the things that have come to mind as I spent 2 days here in this extraordinary, magnificent community with so many of you, and will take back to Boston in thinking about these missions and what we're called to do and how we can connect it to this very important antidote to despair. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I'm conscious of, I'm supposed to be a better doctor and make sure Gustavo doesn't stay up late, and I know that Steve is going to come up and moderate a little bit. I just want to say, the story of the commerce, the traffic in medications and in services, that's, of course, exactly what Gutierrez meant when he said, "My mother's not a shirt," right? And just so, especially to the younger people here, the commodification of medicine continues apace throughout the world. It is something you buy. I'm not just talking about medications, but services. And therefore, those who cannot pay for those services in the world are out of luck, right? They don't have safety nets. And even in countries with safety nets around healthcare, education, and water, they're not good enough. The gaps in them, the mesh is so, the holes are so big. This is true in a lot of rich countries too. When the rich countries with poor safety nets and lots of poor people who fall right through. We're 30 years of progress against poverty, and as Robert said, a certain relaxation in the idea that Father Gustavo Gutierrez is public enemy number one. I love that idea. I want a little wanted poster with Father Gustavo on it. We've got a long way to go. We've got a long way to go as a species until we can do what Father Gustavo says is every person is a person. And any force that excludes people and makes them non-people and assaults their dignity is unacceptable in this hopeful but ambitious vision. So, I hope we'll have some time to talk together. That's been your cue. Like 3 times I've hinted that you should come up. He just gave him a cough drop. Those don't work, Steve.
It will work? What would a doctor do here?
Examine, get out albuterol. Go ahead. Okay. Go do your thing. Mind your own business.
Mind my own business. So actually, I have to admit, I stand corrected. I was reading the quote from Desmond Tutu, and in fact, it does say, the book is erudite, fresh, and even at turns.
That hurts.
Witty. I stand corrected. But I also do want to say the book is, what's wonderful about this book is, for both of the authors, looks clearly in the face of what seemingly are the most intractable problems. Institutional evil, the kinds of complex situations you just can't wrap your head around. And in both cases, there's a charting of a path forward, to something better. And I think that's what really makes this such a wonderful book. And to use the language of Father Gustavo, the mil maneras, it's not just global health and theology, but it's all the different things that all of us do that are part of those mil maneras, the 1,000 different paths to both thinking systematically about these things and also to addressing them. And so we'd love to have a dialogue. We maybe have about 15 minutes. So we have a couple microphones, and I'm simply going to invite who would like to come to the microphone. And please introduce yourself and ask a question or make a comment. Briefly, though.
Good evening. This isn't addressed to any of you in particular. I'd welcome any insights in this regard, but I'm 18, raised a Catholic, so perhaps that's what's influencing my views in this regard. But it feels that helping people who need the most help is just an intuitive truth. It just makes sense to me. And so I'm curious as to what you suspect about human nature, or perhaps what corrupts human nature, so that a preferential option for the poor needs to be taught or reinforced, as opposed to something that, at least for me, it just feels natural.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say one brief thing, which, as you've already learned, is not my specialty, concision. It does seem intuitive, right? And helping people is clearly something that, we see all over the world, people trying to look out for each other and help each other. But just take medicine, or, and please also think about education, the work of, one of the things we've been discussing is development assistance, right? Humanitarian work. I'll start with medicine and stop there, but you ask, well, does medicine make a preferential option for the poor? Does nursing make a preferential? Let's just say clinical medicine. And then you see that, in fact, it's not the poor who have the best access to the best care. It's not, and then you look at the poor in a poor country, or a rural poor in a poor country, many of them don't have access at all to modern medicine. And that was our experience that brought Ophelia, Jim Kim, Loon, our coworkers, and that's what brought us together, is a near absence of a preferential option for the poor in healthcare. But in the United States, we have a serious problem in terms of the quality of care, access to care for chronic disease, for example. We're not doing a good job, or good enough job for anyone, but we're not making a preferential option for the poor. So these ideas, I'm just saying, not when I was your age, I wish that I had already known them when I was 18. I think Robert said something along those lines. They're very useful, no matter how empathetic we may feel, how much human feeling we may have for others who are suffering or around us. In my experience, very useful reminders that we have a long way to go. And I can't think of any. Do engineers make a preferential option for the poor? Do research scientists? Do even public schools are better for the non-poor? And so I that's just I'm not a theologian, nor do I play one on TV, but I think in medicine at least, it's a very useful way to orient engagement.
Anyone else?
If I could add something to that, why don't we respond more naturally to the poor? Well, I think that you see around us so much evidence of the demonization of the poor. That the poor are blamed for being poor. There's a rising ideology that the poor should need to be punished somehow because they've got their own bad habits and their own laziness. They want to be takers. They want to just feed off of the public trough. And this you see that all around, that that the poor should, needed to become more responsible for themselves and that sort of thing. And I think that there's so many different ways, and Gustavo has written all about Las Casas and the conquest of the Americas and the Spanish conquistadors who saw the Indians as the other, as not human. And there's so many different ways that we do that. We render the other less than human. And it blunts maybe what you might think was otherwise our instinct for fellow feeling and solidarity.
Thank you. Maybe I'll ask, what, you want to go on? Oh, Gustavo, please.
Maybe it's good to recall one obvious point, really. But if we say preferential, it's because in order to understand this, it means they are first, not the only one. The love to the poor is first, is preference, because they are in need, because they are living in human conditions. It is the question. The question is not for a Christian, God loves any person. It's universal love. And we cannot choose to say, good, but myself, I love the poor, the other, not interested. Well, it is not the idea. It's not so. Because we need to do the effort to express also our closeness, our love to other persons. But the question is preference, that is to say priority. I like, this is the last word, I like to recall this preference, priority are coming from an ordinal number, first. One ordinal number, I say first, is because I suppose the possibility a second, third, fourth, fifth. I am affirming one is not asking for two, First, yes. And it is very important because preference is not exclusivity. It is intention, not contradiction, but intention with universality. But never we must forget a Christian love is a universal love. No one is excluded of the love of God. No one could be excluded of our own love.
Thank you very much. Now, please.
Hi, Dr. Farmer. I'm Matthew Sosa, a freshman here. I understand that diseases like tuberculosis and AIDS have been the top killers around the world, but NTDs such as elephantitis are equally devastating, but usually neglected by the public.
Yeah.
And actually, our university has a program in Haiti trying to cure these NTDs. I just want to know what is your opinion on NTDs and what are your suggestions for our program?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a very admirable program. First, let me say that, and my views are that, I don't know if Father John's still here, but give him the message, keep doing it. And the term NTD, neglected tropical disease, one way of going back to the notion of a preferential option of the poor is to remember that all diseases that afflict the poor are neglected, right? And that's so, if we can use the same idea of an ordinal number, a preference, and identify some ranking problems, then we should. So that's the first point, is look at the burden of disease wherever it is, right? What are the ranking, let's say, what are the top 5 killers in South Bend, Indiana? What are the top 5 killers in, Malawi? figure that out. That's just a simple burden of, not simple, sorry. That is a burden of disease analysis. And the next thing we do is look at the gap. What's getting neglected? As you mentioned, if you just look 10 years ago, which I think this is what Ophelia was saying, 10 years ago, 13 years ago, when HIV overtook tuberculosis as the leading infectious killer of young adults, don't forget the leading infectious killer of people with HIV was TB. So when these two illnesses continued to surge, there were no publicly funded programs to take care of people with these chronic infectious diseases. There was no funding. There was no safety net. That's still a big challenge, but very different now, right? And so the gap has been lessened a little bit for some diseases, but not others. You mentioned, elephantiasis. And you could then say, well, what about cancers? What about, it's not a competition between different pathologies, it's understanding that burden of disease and then understanding what the gaps are. And that's where, again, preferential option of the poor can make it a little bit easier, perhaps, to sort through what should be our priorities if the mission of a place like Notre Dame or Harvard, which may surprise you to know that the mission of Harvard Medical School is to reduce human suffering caused by disease. Right? It doesn't say human suffering in Boston. And so we got a lot of work to do, again, take on those diseases and any others. And I'll save my specific comments on how we might do a better job managing these chronic infections. Be glad to talk with you about it afterwards, or anybody else who will put up with me.
Thank you.
Well, this is actually perfect because in terms of both the continuing work we have to do and the opportunity that we're going to have to continue this conversation afterwards, I just want to end with kind of just two really quick comments. One is reflecting just a bit about this book, which, as Father John described, really went back to when Paul was initially in Haiti reading this book, inspired by this work. A decade later, they meet. 2 decades later, there are really dialogues here 2 years ago that really come to fruition, leading to something that I think is really remarkable in that it's the views that intersect, that connect this serious analysis of what's going on out in the world and how to do something about it. And one of the things that was really exciting, both Paul and Ophelia mentioned this, is that kind of in this front center group, there's a group of people that came in to Notre Dame from Haiti, from Mexico, from around the globe, many of them working, connected with Partners in Health in the kind of deep in the bowels of some of the most challenging issues related to global health, and to ask questions that kind of aspire to look forward to how things could be different, and how these central ideas of preferential option for the poor, and particularly this idea of accompaniment, and what would it mean if we walk together, and as it relates to international development aid, and if we could reconceptualize what aid means, instead of thinking about aid, the rich helping the poor, the donor helping the beneficiary, that we walk together in this. And so I think a product that we hope to see and shown off here in the not too distant future will be a book that looks at from aid to accompaniment, that looks at the case studies of many of the people working in the field, reflecting and influenced and always with the foundation of Father Gustavo's work in mind, helping guide that. And it's really something that helps chart a path forward for the collective work that we might do together. So it's just with enormous pleasure I want to have us all join in thanking our panelists tonight in helping us introduce us to this marvelous work. And so in a final comment that I did mention, there's a number of people that they were at the conference, and so they have some name tags. For those of you that are interested in these issues, ask these people who they are, what they're doing. I think you'll hear some wonderful stories and engagements of great accompagnateurs. And we'd like to accompany you and all in a reception. I believe all our panelists are going to be able to stay around. And any final comments? from our panel?
Oh, thank you. You know, you can't say thank you too often. And I just would like to thank you, Steve, and all of our accompagnators at Kellogg and at Notre Dame, and to our colleagues who came from the places where they work to think about these challenges and what it means to make a preferential option for the poor, and why it's so useful to think about accompaniment. We really want to say thank you, and to Mike and Jenny for editing the book.
Great. Thank you.